Spiderhead is an ultra-modern prison that more closely resembles a hotel. In this facility, the prisoners live under a more relaxed regime. They have the right to walk around, interact with each other, and have the opportunity to reduce their sentences and receive bonuses. But all of this comes at a price. Spiderhead conducts medical tests, and not all of them are harmless. To be fair, it must be said that all experiments are voluntary, and every prisoner has the right to refuse and return to a cell in another regular prison. One of the prisoners, Ray, sits in a chair in front of a mirrored window, and Steve announces the start of the experiment, injecting a substance into Ray's bloodstream. After a few minutes, they administer the first dose of the drug to the subject and begin reciting simple jokes, which causes Ray to burst into hysterical laughter. When the jokes are replaced by somber facts, the subject's reaction remains the same. Ray continues to laugh ironically. Another morning at Spiderhead is no different from the previous ones. The prisoners are awakened by a loudspeaker, and their names are immediately announced to participate in the experiments. Steve asks Jeff if he is willing to test the new compound, N40, on himself, something that no one has ever tried before. The guy accepts to participate in the experiment without hesitation. Besides the test drug, they administer another substance to enhance the brain's speech centers. This allows Jeff to describe his state in great detail, mentioning the smallest particulars. Upon returning to the Spiderhead complex, Jeff meets with Lizzie and tells her about his walk today. Unfortunately, he cannot recount everything he saw because, after taking the vocabulary-enhancing substance, a side effect occurs. Jeff cannot say even a few words. The only thing the boy remembers is that everything surrounding him during the experiment, whether flowers or factory chimneys, provoked the most intense feelings of love and admiration in him. At night, while lying in his bed, Jeff remembers how he ended up in prison. He and his friend decided to go for a joyride at a party, and Jeff, intoxicated, took the wheel. The next day, the N40 trials, now called Cupid, continue. But this time, Jeff is not alone. Heather, a bold girl who changes her opinion about her partner in just a few seconds after the drug's administration, is invited to join him. The couple's conversation lasts only a few seconds before they can no longer resist and give in to intimacy. They don't care that they are being observed and filmed, as the substance completely disconnects their minds from their internal barriers. The process concludes with the young people confessing their love for each other, which pleases Steve, who instructs his colleague, Mark, to observe the subjects closely to see how they behave when the effects of the substance wear off. The couple feels uncomfortable after what happened and tries not to talk about it with anyone. Jeff continues to spend his free time with Lizzie without telling her what happened during the experiments and avoids encounters with Heather. The next day, they administer the same dose of Cupid to Jeff, but this time in a double dose, and instead of Heather, there is an older woman in the room, whom Jeff, now sober, looks at with repulsion. However, as soon as the substance enters his bloodstream, he gives himself over to love with her. After this experiment, Jeff asks Mark to remove him from the kitchen where he works with Lizzie because he feels uncomfortable interacting with his girlfriend. Steve takes Jeff to the laboratory, but this time he is on the other side of the glass. Steve shows Jeff that his two previous partners are in the experiment room. The supervisor offers Jeff the option to choose which of the two girls will receive the substance that induces intense fear and pain. But Jeff cannot choose. He is indifferent to both girls and cannot wish them harm. In the end, they simply release the girls, canceling the experiment. Having the right to another walk on Friday, Jeff calls his girlfriend, who was with him the night of the accident, but again only reaches the voicemail. In the afternoon, Jeff spends time with Lizzie preparing a small Christmas surprise for her. When Jeff finds himself in the familiar chair in the laboratory, he sees Rogan in front of him, a massive prisoner covered in tattoos. Jeff remembers everything that happened with the girls in the previous days and refuses to participate in the experiment. Nothing happens, and the men are simply released after a couple of minutes of silence. Jeff realizes what just happened. He and Rogan were partners, and one of the female prisoners had to choose which of them would receive the medication. Bursting into Steve's office, Jeff confirms his suspicions upon seeing Heather there. Moreover, the doctor doesn't even argue with the prisoner. On the contrary, he shows him a diagram of who should approach whom under the influence of the drug. In response to Jeff's complaints, Steve reminds him that being at Spiderhead is a privilege, and if he is not satisfied, he can transfer to a regular prison, albeit with no hope of early release. Understanding the hint, the next time Jeff sits quietly in the same room as Rogan without hysterics. Steve sends Mark on a weekend break, advising his friend to enjoy his time on the continent. Steve himself decides to take Cupid to experience the ecstasy he had only seen in his subjects before. The experiments continue, and Steve warns Jeff that they will have to administer Darkenflox to the girls, as a committee demands the purity of the experiment. Jeff tries to explain that he does not want anyone to experience the effects of this substance, regardless of his feelings towards the girls. However, Steve remains firm and reminds Jeff of all the privileges he enjoys by cooperating with them. Not wanting to return to a regular prison, Jeff agrees to administer Darkenflox to Heather. Heather begins to cry and panic, but the management calmly records the data, listening to Jeff's comments, which contain no hint of romantic feelings. The experiment's objective is achieved, and Steve plans to conclude it. But an error occurs, and Heather loses control. She seizes a sharp object and frees herself from the torment caused by the Darkenflox. While Steve and Mark deal with Heather, Jeff notices the supervisor's lost keys and finds a notebook with records of upcoming experiments and a lottery ticket with the same numbers as the names of the medications being administered. Realizing that Steve is no longer behind the glass, Jeff manages to close the safe and throws the keys back so the doctor doesn't realize his secret has been exposed. Steve warns Mark that if anyone finds out what happened with Heather and he has to answer for it, he will drag everyone who participated in the experiment down with him. Lizzie participates in the experiments for the first time, and the first thing she is given is Darkenflox. After experiencing it, she meets Jeff in a secluded place and shares her feelings with him. Lizzie confesses that she is not sure if Spiderhead is better than a regular prison with the strictest regime. In turn, Jeff also opens up to his girlfriend and confesses that on the night of the accident, it wasn't just his friend in the car, but also his beloved girlfriend, who did not survive the ride. That is why he voluntarily submits to the trials, hoping to somehow redeem his guilt. The sincere conversation between the two leads to them spending the night together. Steve quickly deduces the close relationship between them and decides to use this connection for his own purposes. When Jeff arrives for the next experiment, he learns that today he must choose between administering Darkenflox to Lizzie or leaving Spiderhead. Jeff refuses, but the doctor gives him the chance to postpone the experiment until the morning. When he meets the defiant young man again, he is armed with Lizzie's personal file. It turns out that the crime for which the girl is serving her sentence is so terrifying to her that no amount of Darkenflox could make it worse. Steve watches with pleasure as Jeff adjusts the dose scale to the maximum. However, he quickly realizes that Jeff intends to experiment on him, not on his girlfriend. Mark, realizing that he has also fallen into Steve's trap with the prisoners, decides to rectify the situation and hands the remote control to Jeff. The prisoner receives all the necessary information from Steve and persuades him to open the main exit so that he and Lizzie can leave the prison. But the supervisor grabs the remote control and administers the maximum dose of Darkenflox to the girl, causing her intense suffering. He then destroys his cell phone to prevent anyone from canceling his order. The couple manages to free themselves from the effects of the medications and runs out of the laboratory. At the same time, Steve announces over the loudspeaker that due to the fugitives, everyone else will be sent back to the prisons where their comfortable stays will end. Jeff and Lizzie become the target of a manhunt. Dozens of hardened criminals, including the enormous, tattooed Rogan, plan to confront the couple who have deprived them of all the facility's privileges. Steve tries to escape with the medications, as the police boats called by Mark are about to approach Spiderhead. Steve manages to leave the base and take off in a small plane before the authorities arrive. But since his remote control is shattered, the medications are injected into his bloodstream in massive quantities. Another release of Cupid induces admiration, and the man steers the plane towards a small rocky island, seeing it as paradise. Mark, on the police boat, watches as his former boss circles over the sea before crashing into the rocks. Jeff and Lizzie hijack a boat and manage to escape before the police arrive. Happy and free, the young couple only regrets that Steve did not invent a substance that could not be used for self-forgiveness. Subscribe for more videos like this, activate notifications, and leave a like to help the channel. Thanks for watching.